What's up, Jacket Nation? Welcome to another episode of Jacket Chats. I am your host, Bryce Johnson, episode 2 of Jacket Chats, and today I'm joined by Lilja McKendry of the Black Hills State Triathlon team. Lilja, how are you today?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for taking the time to join us. We'll jump right into it. So, why Black Hills State University? What made you want to come to Black Hills State and compete on the triathlon team?
So, I've originally lived in large coastal cities my entire life, and when I was searching through different schools, I did have a pretty decent range of options coming out of high school, and the biggest thing that was a concern to me was finding the right environment for a school, because you can pretty much find a political science degree at any school. And so finding the right surrounding area and the right people for a team, as well as the right match for a coach, was really first and foremost in my decision making. So when I came out here for my visit, it was the surrounding area that stood out to me, how kind people were and how welcoming the team and the coach was. Connie is super, super great and super, super supportive. And so that was really probably the highest on my list of my decision making.
Yeah, in my 1 year here, one thing that's really stood out to me about Connie is how kind of supporting she is in all aspects. And you're originally from the West Coast, right? Well, you're born on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And then before college, you lived on the East Coast in Virginia. Yep. We were talking about it before we hopped on the air here. So, what did you know about Black Hills State before that, and how did you make that decision to come literally halfway across the country to Black Hills State?
So I met Connie and members of the team at the Sarasota Bradenton National Championships back in 2018. And this was the national championships that I used to qualify for World Championships. And so she was really, really welcoming, really, engaging with conversation there. And so I had been out here in this area before because my parents did an Ironman in Coeur d'Alene. And so when I was really young, I had been through here and very distinctly remember the mountains and the nature. And so in my recruiting process, when I thought back to that, that was the first thing that stuck out to me. I was like, oh, the Black Hills, I'm familiar with that. And then in Switzerland, I had raced with their girls and they were super nice. And I was like, okay, the girls on the team here are really nice. And so those were my first impressions of the area. It was great nature and great people. And so certainly was mindful of that coming into my visits here and all throughout my recruiting process.
Yeah, really getting across the country. One coast, the other coast, and now right smack dab in the middle. And kind of off of that, we'll jump around out of order, because you did mention it. In Switzerland, you competed with some former athletes here at Black Hills State. You competed in some triathlons, in fact, quite a few, even before you came out here to Black Hills State. So would you say your pre-college experience as a triathlete is the exception or the rule, not only on your team, but among collegiate athletes and that you compete against at this level?
I would certainly say that on our team and across the board in NCAA Collegiate Triathlon, that there is a huge range of experience levels. And really, the best athletes that we see have a strong background in swimming and a strong background in running. And a lot of times that doesn't mean that they've necessarily had a super strong background in triathlon as a whole. But as triathlon grows as a sport, we do see more triathletes coming into the sport, and that was certainly where I was at coming in. I had been a very strong swimmer my whole life. I had done cross country all through high school, but I had been doing triathlon my whole life because my parents had raced at the Ironman level for a very long time as well. And so I would say it was a little bit of an exception when it came to that. We look for mixed athletes with swimming and cross country and sometimes cycling and cross country, but we're seeing more and more complete triathletes moving into the sport. So it's a little bit of a yes and a no to that question.
Yeah, because triathlon, that's not like an official high school sport,
nope,
right?
It's
not a lot of high
mostly
schools
club.
Yeah. Right. So I'm sure like many triathletes in high school, you were a cross-country runner and you're a swimmer.
Yep.
So how did you get involved in triathlons at that high school level? Because you competed at the national level.
I had done a few triathlons when I was really young. Like I said, my parents actually competed at the World Championship level for Ironman, half Ironman, and duathlon. So they were very successful at it. And so I'd done them pretty sporadically as a kid. And then moving through middle and high school, I was extremely involved in swimming, competed at the national level for swimming, and had some pretty significant back injuries moving through. And so I chose to do a lot of cycling as PT for that to keep up cardio, and was still doing triathlons here and there. And I did a state triathlon championship against a lot of large D1 schools, Liberty, some D2s like Queens, and ended up being really successful at that and qualified for nationals. And that was, I believe, my sophomore year. And then sort of almost fell into it, whereas like, oh, I did really well at this one niche area, and then it continued to do really well at this one niche area. I was like, why don't I make a career out of what I'm really good at, these niche areas? And so I didn't have a club team. I didn't have, obviously, it wasn't a high school sport, so I was trained sort of by my parents. I had a very great early initial coach who trained people for Ironman distance, but he did a really great job training me for sprint distance. And like I said, sort of fell into it in high school a little bit, and it ended up just translating really well with the skills that I had.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised, and you can probably speak better to this than I can. Is that kind of like the common theme, is like, you know, kind of your teammates, they kind of fall into triathlon in a way?
We have a few girls who did club, and like I said, just a huge broad range of experience. We have some girls from the area who did a lot of gravel biking and mountain biking. We have some girls who did very serious club triathlon. We have some girls who did very serious cross country and swimming on the side, and sort of came to it from all walks of life. Our other senior, she did cross-country skiing and cross-country running and golf and all sorts of different things before she came into triathlon. So, yeah, it's not necessarily a traditional thing to just come in doing triathlon by itself.
The prerequisite being just be an athlete, right?
Pretty much. The prerequisite is that you have to be okay with hurting. Because nobody comes into the sport, you know, looking for an easy time. So you have to sort of want for something really, really hard. And so it's a mental prerequisite, even more so than a physical prerequisite sometimes.
That makes a lot of sense. So what is your favorite part about triathlon now? What makes you want to keep doing it?
You know, initially when I first came in, I wasn't a very great cyclist. I was not good at running hills. I wasn't well-rounded in a lot of aspects because I came from a really flat area and lacked a lot of experience. And so as I've grown through my career, enjoying the technical aspects of perfecting the little things is almost my favorite thing, because at this rate, you know, I've done a ton of cycling, I've done a ton of running, and so being able to read a course and be strategic about it, because a lot of people don't consider triathlon to be a strategic sport, but it is very course dependent, it is very competition dependent, and so enjoying the little details rather than one discipline at a time is really what makes me love it as much as I do, because those are the things that are going to continue to evolve and change and keep things interesting, rather than just, well, you know, I like swimming right now, or I like cycling right now, or running. I like how this draft pack worked out this race and how I can improve upon this transition the next race. And so that's really what keeps it interesting and fun for me.
That's a really fascinating answer. So I'm going to jump ahead again, you know. So pre-race, this past Sunday, you guys competed down in Belle-Fourche. What was kind of going through your mind? What was the technical aspects that you were thinking about pre-race, during race on Sunday then?
Pre-race, and I'll jump all the way up to when we're driving up in the van as a team. Beautiful, sunny in Spearfish, about 80 degrees, and you look in the distance and you're like, wow, that looks kind of gray.
Yeah,
it's
it was
just
pretty
this
gnarly
huge wall, this huge cold front. And so we get to the race, and the first thing that I do is get a read on the water, get a read on the wind conditions, right? And so already breaking it down into technical aspect from there. And so, you know, we had a pretty strong southwest wind, which ended up being about 20-25 miles an hour in some aspects, and the water was 18-inch overhead, and it dropped the water temperature. And so it's like,
yeah, it was cold, it was raw, it was windy out there. Yeah.
And so going into it, just looking at, okay, well, this is the wind direction that's going to be there on the swim and the bike and the run. So how am I going to work every corner, you know, on the bike, and how am I going to work with these waves on the swim? And so really breaking it down from a weather aspect first, right? These are the things that I for sure know they're going to be a problem in the race. And then looking at the competition. Well, these are the girls that I know that are going to be really great pack cyclists. And so once I get out of the water, who's going to work with me really well on the bike in this wind? And then getting off of the bike, who do I have to chase down in this run with the wind at my back, with the headwind, on a little hill, because it really wasn't that hilly, but, in a sprint, in a corner, things like that. And so really breaking it down piece by piece is how it really served me well during this Belfouche race. And I think will continue to serve me well throughout the next few races in the postseason.
Yeah, that's really fascinating answer. And you kind of alluded to it because, triathlon, correct me if I'm wrong, it's classified by the NCAA as like an emerging sport, right?
Yep.
So not many schools have it. Just 42 NCAA schools sponsor women's triathlon teams. We're one of them. With that few schools, you do kind of get to know the competition. Like you said, these girls are kind of comparable and will work well with me in a draft pack on the bikes, and they're at all different levels. You got some D2s, maybe some MSU Billings, a handful of D3s. I don't think there are any this past weekend.
No.
But there's a bunch of D1 schools, Arizona State, University of South Dakota, TCU, even this past weekend, University of Denver, University of San Francisco, schools that took 3rd and 5th at the D1 Nationals last year were at your race on Sunday. So what's it like competing against those D1 schools with more resources, but holding your own despite that and kind of competing really well against those higher level teams?
When we discuss resources and athletes at the level of triathlon, it's true that we all compete against each other very closely. And certainly they bring in really, really high-level athletes, either from the United States or from other countries. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity to race with some of these girls that I raced with on the U.S. team, overseas. And that's what I try to view it as, is sometimes it is an intimidating thing to race against these really, really huge D1 schools. I mean, Arizona State compared to Black Hills State University, there's a very large
difference, right?
Yeah, just a small one though. And so trying to view everything as an opportunity to get better is really my prerogative, and I believe everybody else's prerogative on my team. When we go to events like these, you learn a lot from those girls. They have really great resources, and you can learn and adapt to their resources and their training methods and their racing methods when you're racing with them. And so when we look at other D2 schools and D3 schools, I think Colorado Mesa and Black Hills State integrate really, really well with big D1 schools and compete really, really well with big D1 schools because we get to race with them all the time. And that shows generally in our ranking nationally when we do compete at nationals, because we are very, very competitive nationally, whereas other schools, even at the D2 and D3 level, don't necessarily get that opportunity.
That's really awesome. And, like I said, you guys do compete against these bigger schools, and it makes sense that it helps. And, I'm sure that the kind of triathlon community, it's a small community, I'm sure, right? So, what kinds of things have you learned from these other athletes, from other schools?
Certainly drafting on the bike. When we look at really, really large, successful D1 schools, how they utilize each other to be more efficient and to be faster in a race, they're taking top-line methods from the international stage and applying them in training. And that's not to say that we don't do the same, but with their international girls, sometimes they have better, quicker access to those methods. And so really learning to adapt to that very quickly in a race. There's some pack formations that I saw this weekend that I had to learn in like 10, 15 seconds, because otherwise I was going to get dropped and I was not going to be able to utilize those girls in order to block that win the best way that I could. So it's all in the small details, because like I said, the swimming is the swimming, the cycling is the cycling, the running is the running. You either have those skills and have that speed or you don't. But what you pick up in the small details of how they use each other in the swim, how they use each other in the bike, and how they use each other in the run even, is the learning experience that you gain from those large D1 schools.
That's really, really interesting. And you kind of said it, you kind of being around the bush, but the swimming's the swimming, the biking's the biking's, the running's the runnings. It's, at the end of the day, fast time's fast time, you know, and in nature, triathlon's a very individual sport. But there are some team strategies, right?
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
kind of walk us through some of those team strategies.
We can just do it right from the get-go. When you enter the water, there's 100% a drafting and blocking aspect when you enter the water. As you saw probably at the race, on Sunday, everybody's on top of each other. So kind of using each other in order to block other teams from swimming over you is really important. If there's a strong current in the water, using the person in front of you in order to block some of that current is really important. And then when you step out of the water, you get through first transition, hop on the bike. You want somebody to help make you the most efficient that you can be and the fastest that you can be in blocking the wind. So we're constantly switching positions. Sometimes it's with one other person. Sometimes I've been in draft packs where it was 30 people. And so switching positions, trying to catch the people in front of you on the bike, and saving your legs for the run is really how you utilize the people around you. And doing specific things as a team, I have teammates that I work very closely with in how we cycle, because we come out of the water generally at the same time. So understanding when you want to break pack, when you want to use other teams as much as possible, and being strategic about that. And then when you hop off the bike and into the run, there's not much that you can do on the run as far as utilizing other people. That's really when you want to break away. But if it is really windy, using the person in front of you as a shield, and then motivating each other, honestly. There's a lot of talking to each other on the bike and really pushing each other.
That's some really interesting stuff. This is one of the most fun and informative podcasts I've ever been a part of, Lilja, by the way.
There's not
this
a lot
is
of
awesome.
information out there on triathlon.
This
so
is
helps.
really fun. I'm learning a lot here. Now, I kind of mentioned, all these different schools, faraway schools, Arizona State, University of San Francisco, TCU. They all came to South Dakota to compete this past weekend. Mm-hmm. But that goes both ways. You and your team have to go far away to compete at places like Florida. The national championship is at the D2 level is usually in Tempe, right? Mm-hmm. Last year, you went to Stanford down in California. What are those trips kind of like? What's the travel like for those? There's got to be some challenges that come with it, right? Especially you got to get the bikes there somehow, right?
So certainly it gets expensive. And so the first thing that I can say is that coming from a small school and doing a sport that does get really expensive, we're pretty heavily supported by people in the community, small donations. And so every opportunity that we have to race far away, and even at home, every shirt that we wear, every piece of equipment that we have, there's a face and a name behind it when we look at people in the community and people who came out at the races. And so when you look at difficulties, sometimes financing those things, there's a little bit of trouble, but we receive a massive amount of support from people in the community. And so it can't be overstated enough that the benefit of a small school being so grateful for the resources that we have before we ever even get to the race is that I can think of and thank each individual person for all of the opportunities that I have, because it does take a village to get us to some of those races. But beyond that, gosh, some of the airport troubles that we've had with the bikes, and I love my coach to death, but I never seen anybody speed walk like that through an airport. And so, I think a lot of the times once we get through the airport and onto the plane, like that's half the battle. But certainly we spend a lot of time in Airbnbs together and trading off lots of cooking and lots of, stretching together and juggling different bedtimes and like how we live together within a really close confined space before a really stressful event. And so definitely trading off little household things sometimes can be a little bit of a struggle. So we try to really direct tasks to each other and be really smart about how we do it, because you've got high emotion already. And so sometimes when you're trying to cook chicken, that's somehow the biggest struggle within a trip is like, oh, who's going to make this meal and how are we going to get to this airport on time and make this flight? And so it's not even the race itself sometimes, but we work really well together as a team, and we've continued to sort of evolve that process, so that helps a lot.
I will say, cooking chicken, it can be tricky. It's a funky meat. You never
know
how it's going to go.
Are you going to grill it? That really depends, yeah.
Now, on the flip side of the travel, I've mentioned it a couple times. On Sunday, you had a rare home event. Usually you guys have maybe one, maybe two. This year, or this academic year, you're scheduled to have a second one with the Black Hills Tri-Fest in the spring.
Yep.
This week, it was a quote-unquote home event over in Belle Fourche.
Yep. Still
a 20-minute drive, but that's not a big deal. It's a rare event that is more or less on your own turf. What was it like for you, kind of being on your own turf, being around, your own area, being able to sleep in your own bed the night before competition? What was that like?
First of all, the opportunity to sleep in before a race, that was really strange. Normally we're up by like 4 a.m. sometimes to get to these races.
It was a late start, yeah.
It was a late start, and so it was a little bit scary waking up and seeing the sun before a race. I was like, I overslept. But we had a lot of really great opportunities to train on that course and really fine-tune our skills, and so that can't be overstated enough. The team really prepares the best we can for every course that we race on, whether it's 2,000 miles away or 20 minutes away. But it is really great when we're able to understand the water conditions and understand, the hills and stuff on the bike. And so that opportunity to be able to really feel for the course can't be overstated enough, because we don't get to do that often. Usually we're not going in blind, but you don't know every little corner and you don't know the water conditions. And so when we're racing far, far away, and so that's really nice. To be able to sleep in is really nice. To be able to garner so much support from the local area with all the people, again, who came out and supported is really, really nice. Because sometimes, when we look at our little cheering squad far away, it's like a few parents and ourselves cheering for each other. And so all the support from the local community and the school itself was really, really great.
Yeah, it was a pretty good showing from the community, employees here at Black Hills State, supporters of BH Athletics and the triathlon program. It was a really good showing out there.
Yeah.
I was very impressed coming out on a Sunday afternoon. And, you kind of mentioned it earlier. Super windy down there in Belle Fourche. The conditions, they were tough, to the point where they blew the buoys off course, right? So, how much do the elements factor into your race and maybe change your preparation for that one?
A lot of times they decide a race. Whether the wind and the wave conditions become too strong for the swim, sometimes they'll cancel a swim altogether for those things. And so then you have to adapt to a duathlon, which we've done before.
Were we close to doing that potentially on
I wouldn't
Sunday?
say,
do you know?
And perhaps this is my experience with ocean swimming, because I do a lot of that. I would not say that we were necessarily close to that, but
they did shorten it.
They did shorten it, and so that's the first step before you end up having to close a course. And so I would say, had the wind been 10 miles an hour stronger, had the waves been another 6-inch higher, we could have been very realistically looking at that, because it's when you delve into dangerous conditions for a race, and that's not what you want at all.
Athlete safety always takes priority, right?
Absolutely. And with that, again, the wind conditions on the bike and all of that can decide people's races. Unfortunately, we had a crash on the course that was probably pretty heavily influenced by the wind. And so when you look at these conditions, that can make or break, quite literally, a race. So certainly being cognizant of that, but that is the nature of the sport. You're not there to be comfortable and have it be easy. Nobody ever chooses to do triathlon because they're like, yeah, this is going to feel good. You know what I mean?
Did it change your preparation at all?
Probably a longer warm-up, but the course is the course. The triathlon is the triathlon. The distance is the distance, and that is what it is. And so maybe some mental preparation to be in for a little bit more hurt than you previously expected. But aside from that, I think we just warmed up our limbs perhaps a little bit more than we normally would, and got right into it. There's nothing that you can do to change the conditions except perform accordingly.
Yeah, dive right in, quite literally, right? Yeah. And personally, you had a strong showing on Sunday, BHSU's top finisher. What made you successful on Sunday?
Reading conditions, especially in the water, swimming accordingly, utilizing the people around me on the bike. My performance is my performance. And so I think I attribute it to a lot of really hard training over the last few weeks. And I think that my training speaks for itself, and you can have a good race, you can have an off race, and so I just ended up having a really great race that day, and so super grateful for that.
I actually missed a question earlier, but it actually ties right in. What does your training regimen kind of look like, given that is such a unique sport, 3 really specialized elements? Maybe how does it differ from other sports, do you think?
The volume and the variety for sure. We wake up, in the morning. We train 6 days a week. Many of those days we're training 3 times a day. So we get up. Sometimes we're running and swimming at, 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier. Go through all of our classes, get into our second practice of the day, which is, could be any one of the 3 disciplines. And then our third practice of the day, we supplement everything with yoga or strength. And training really goes beyond the practice venue as well. We have to do a ton of recovery stuff, a lot of ice, Epsom salt bath, trips to the trainer, careful diet, and not diet in the aspect of limiting calories, but making sure that you get enough in. I mean, we're burning north of 3,000, 4,000 calories a day sometimes. And so it involves every single bit of your day. I mean, I'm stretching out in class sometimes to make sure that I don't catch a cramp during my second or third practice of the day. And so that's usually what it's like during the week. And then on the weekend, we'll have sometimes practices that are 3 or 4 hours long in order to sort of fine tune all of the really specialized parts that we prepare for in a race.
So the answer would be rigorous.
Yes, extremely.
And looking ahead, you have the West Regional Qualifier in Montana next week on October 15th. What are your expectations heading into that one, both individually and as a team?
So that'll actually be in Missouri.
I stand corrected.
That's all right. It's, kind of in the general area. Our team in last year and how we performed in Missouri was very, very successful there as well. And so we're going to be racing against a lot of the same D1 schools, even faster D1 schools, larger D1 schools, and very successful D2 schools and D3 schools. And so we're going to have a huge, huge range and variety and competitiveness from the people that we're with. And so, but I think this weekend was a really great gauge of that and how we're going to do, because likely it's going to be the very same race conditions, pretty fast multi-loop course. I'm sure the water's going to be a little bit windy, a little bit wavy, same way it was last year. And so we got the chance to utilize the wetsuits. We got a chance to utilize biking and running in the wind. And so I would say that we're going to sharpen a few things over the next few weeks before we get ready for that. But the skills are there for the team. The cardio base is there. And I think we're going to perform really, really strongly at that, because that is a course type that we're very much used to and very much successful on.
So you would say the elements from this past weekend, while they were difficult, helped you prepare for this coming one?
100%. I think it's the elements were harder this past weekend, and that's almost going to make, this coming race seem easier in a lot of aspects. Not necessarily the competition, but I think the mental prep of, at least it's not going to be 50 degrees with 20 mile an hour, 30 mile an hour winds. There's that can't be overstated enough.
Silver linings, right?
Absolutely.
Linings.
You got to find them where you can in triathlon.
I can only imagine. We'll roll into some rapid fire questions, kind of shorter form questions, shorter answers. You kind of alluded to it, but walk us through a quote unquote normal day in the life in Lilja McKendry.
The normal day sometimes starts at 5 a.m., 4:50 in the morning.
I'm not even awake yet. I'm not even awake for another 2 hours, but go ahead.
So rolling through, hydrating, getting a little bit of food in before I go into my first practice. Usually I'm out of that by 7:30 a.m. 8 o'clock in the morning. I take 18 credits this semester, so I'm going into 3 classes throughout the day. And those will end around 2:30 p.m. I get to my first practice at 3 p.m., get out of that probably around 4:30, get to my second practice at 4:45, get out of that probably around like 5:36, and then it's homework. It's homework until probably around 10 p.m. and doing a lot of meal prep, a lot of, things to make sure that I stay healthy while I'm doing that homework, and that's right back to bed. It's pretty day in, day out. It's training in school, and so there's not a lot of room for downtime there at all.
Yeah, I was about to say, there does not sound like there's a lot of just hanging out and doing whatever on most days. If you could compete in any other collegiate sport, what would it be?
Oh, man. That's a good question. I think certainly swimming is pretty, that's where my background, it is. I guess I've got so many options to choose from with triathlon. I had a pretty good background in mixed martial arts and lots of lifting, so potentially, I don't know if they have women's wrestling, but collegiate wrestling would probably be, strangely enough, my next choice.
There's a handful of schools that have women's wrestling. That's actually a really good answer. What is on your race day playlist, if anything?
Oh, man, I listen to a lot of metal, so certainly that's a good question. I've got a pretty good range. I hate to go with the pretty cheesy standard choice, but I do listen to a lot of Eminem to get myself hyped up before a race. A lot of Styx, Ozzy Osbourne. Gosh, I could go on for days with different bands from the 80s and 90s. Deftones. But yeah, you're looking at a range from early 80s to, early 2000s of metal and sometimes rap. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly a range there, but I could see it. I could see a lot of those. Those are some really good race day songs. Do you have any race day superstitions?
Man, I only drink red Gatorade on my race days. I don't know why, but I've been doing that since I was probably 6 or 7 years old.
You're only limited to red Gatorade on race days, though? Any other practice you can go with anything?
I have had the same pre-race stretch routine that my dad taught me probably when I was like 5 or 6 that I've been doing, and maybe that's a family nostalgia thing as much as it is superstition, but I can't say that anytime I've missed out on that I've had a good race. So I always kind of count on that pre-race stretch routine that my dad taught me when I was really young and some red Gatorade.
I guess with a sport that kind of does have all these elements that can be out of your control, that one controllable of that routine, that stretch routine, it would, I think it would mentally help me
it's a grounding factor for sure.
Yeah. And last but not least, what is one thing that most people do not know about you?
In the summer, certainly this last summer, I actually completely switched gears. And so I do surf lifesaving, so I do a lot of ocean rescue in the summer. I've done 5 years of it, and I compete on the surf rescue racing team. And the bulk majority of what I do for that is sprinting. I do sand sprinting pretty much, and sprinting in the water, which is not like triathlon at all. I do the 4x100 meter sprint, the 90-yard dash, and a lot of other sprinting events that are sometimes only limited to 25 yards. So I completely change gears and do a lot of sprinting in the summer versus anything long distance and triathlon related.
Hey, anything to compete, right?
Anything to compete, yep.
Lilja McKendry, hey, this was a lot of fun. This was really informative. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Until next time, I'm your host, Bryce Johnson, for Jacket Chats.